Langton present her summation on behalf of her client, the defendant. Today you will hear from the District Attorney, Mr. Karp. Again, Dermundy paused to allow the jurors to keep up. They looked worn out, their faces set in stone. They just wanted to go home to their families. Murder trials were tough enough on jurors, especially when they had to be sequestered, but death penalty cases were particularly emotionally and physically draining. Still, he needed them to hang in there a little while longer. Then we'll all get to go home, Dermundy thought. But he also knew from his lengthy prosecutorial background and distinguished service on the bench that this was a case no one would ever forget. Let me remind you once again that during summation, the attorneys will tell you what they believe the evidence shows. However, what they say is not evidence, and it will be up to you to decide what weight, if any, to give their presentations. Do you understand? He was pleased to see them all nod. Will you promise to focus one more time on what is said today, and then after the lawyers give their final arguments, their summations, and I charge you on the law, meaning simply give my legal instructions to you, you will deliberate and render a fair and just verdict? Again, 12 heads went up and down. Good. I thank you. Satisfied that the jury was in the proper frame of mind, Dermundy turned his attention to the prosecution table and said, Mr. Karp, are you ready to proceed? Roger Butch Karp, all 6'5" of him, tapped the yellow legal pad he'd been making notes on and rose from his seat. Yes, Your Honor. Oh, then please, the floor is yours. Dressed in his usual off-the-rack bar mitzvah blue suit, Karp came out from around the table and walked over to stand in front of the defense table, limping slightly from having aggravated an old basketball injury to his right knee. He looked down for a moment at the defendant, who quickly averted his eyes, his face drained of what little color he had left after several months incarcerated in the Tombs, the hellhole otherwise known as the Manhattan House of Detention for Men. Shaking his head, Karp then turned to face the jury box, fixing his gold-flecked gray eyes on each juror for a moment before moving to the next. He nodded when he reached the last face, then began. As you now have experienced, a capital murder trial has two separate phases. In law, we say it is a bifurcated proceeding. In Phase 1, the guilt phase, you, the jury, determined that the defendant is guilty of the murders for which he was charged. Phase 2, the sentencing phase, deals with whether, in your opinion, and based on the law, the defendant should be sentenced to death. Karp let the finality of that sink in before continuing. For the past couple of weeks, on behalf of the people, my colleague Ray Guma and I have presented evidence, what we call aggravating factors, that more than justifies sentencing this defendant to death. For example, you were shown additional crime scene photographs and heard from the people's witnesses who graphically described the vicious nature of the defendant's merciless attacks on the deceased, Olivia Yancey and Beth Jenkins. But, other than a brief few minutes in which Olivia's husband Dale spoke movingly, you heard very little about these women as real, living, breathing individuals. Turning to point at the defense table, Karp said, And as you know, the defense then presented its case, arguing that there were mitigating circumstances for why the defendant committed these crimes. The defense hopes this will persuade you to vote against invoking the death penalty. As such, you listened to a great deal about the defendant, his abused childhood, the violence he may have witnessed at an early age, the absence of convictions for other violent crimes, and how he may have been sexually assaulted while serving time in a juvenile detention facility some 5 years ago. Karp walked slowly over to the defense table until he was standing in front of it. If these things are true, then we certainly agree that no child